This video is brought to you by Babbel, the language learning app that teaches real-world practical conversations. Get up to 65% off by following the link in the description. More on this later. Just after 11 PM on the evening of April 1st, 1982, a group of Argentinian Marines stepped out of rubber boats onto the Falkland Islands, an isolated and windswept archipelago in the South Atlantic, controlled by the United Kingdom. After decades of failed negotiations and months of preparation, the reconquest of what they called Las Malvinas was underway. It was the start of a 10-week war that would end with hundreds of casualties, controversy, and profound effects on both Britain and Argentina. The Falklands War had begun. At the heart of the events of 1982 was a complicated territorial dispute over the Falklands that went back centuries. Its intricacies are not the subject of this series or this video, but it's worth going over the basics. The Falkland Islands were first claimed by the English, first settled by the French, and first governed by the Spanish. When Argentina gained its independence from the Spanish Empire shortly after the turn of the 19th century, it considered that Las Malvinas was an integral part of its colonial inheritance. Britain disputed this and ended up sending ships to assert control over the islands in 1833. The Falklands became a crown colony in 1840 and grew into an important coaling station for Royal Navy ships operating in the South Atlantic. The dispute over the island's sovereignty simmered away until Argentina approached the UN in the 1960s for help with realising its claim, citing the continuing British control of the islands as an example of colonialism. Britain agreed to take part in talks but proved reluctant to allow any transfer of the islands unless the islanders themselves, who considered themselves British, consented, citing their right to self-determination, another key UN principle. From the mid-1970s, the two nations' relationship began to slide downhill after a military junta seized control of Argentina in 1976. By the end of that year, Buenos Aires had severed ambassadorial relations with Britain and put 50 military personnel ashore on southern Thule, a fantastically isolated area in the South Sandwich Islands, which were also controlled by Britain and claimed by Argentina. Remote as they were, this was a clear attack on Britain's sovereignty over its South Atlantic territories and a shot across the bows on the Falklands issue. It was serious and provoked a response from Britain of nothing. Nothing other than strongly worded letters. The Argentine presence on southern Thule was not evicted. The British House of Commons would not even find out about the occupation of southern Thule for 2 years after it happened. Efforts to resolve the issue continued after the election of Margaret Thatcher's government in 1979, which had the novel idea of transferring sovereignty to Argentina but leasing the islands back to Britain for 99 years afterwards. This seemed like a clever solution but fell apart in the face of opposition from first the Falkland Islanders and then British MPs. By 1981, the UK had no clear plan on the Falklands other than playing for time and trying to avoid the Argentinians doing anything too dramatic. The trouble was, to Argentina it looked rather a lot like Britain just wasn't that bothered about the islands at all. This video is brought to you by Babbel, the language learning app that teaches real-world practical conversations. Babbel is an excellent option if you want to start picking up a second or third language while juggling other commitments, and the app's technology can get you speaking in just 3 weeks. A common struggle I have always had with making history videos is being distinctly monolingual and not being able to read primary or secondary sources written in another language. For the Falklands War series, of which this video is the first part, not being able to speak or read Spanish at anything more than a half-remembered high school level has made it more challenging to cover every angle. Getting the right pronunciation of names and places can also be a struggle. Babel can help with this with its speech recognition technology, which helps to improve pronunciation right from the start. Its lessons are short and concise and put together by real language teachers. There's a variety of ways to learn, from lessons to podcasts, and you can tailor your learning to topics that interest you. You can get up to 65% off your subscription to Babel by following the link in the description, and if you're not satisfied, there's a 20-day money-back guarantee. Thanks to Babel for sponsoring this video. In 1981, the Thatcher government announced massive defence spending cuts after a review by the Defence Secretary John Nott. Whitehall cuts to the defence budget were nothing new, but this particular round was an absolute hammer blow to the Royal Navy, which was to lose both its carriers and amphibious assault ships. Prime Minister Thatcher approved these cuts because she was keen that Britain's overall public expenditure had to be slashed. Perhaps most importantly, she agreed with Nott's desire to withdraw the Navy's only presence in the South Atlantic, the patrol ship HMS Endurance. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, had opposed this, insisting that the withdrawal of the ship would be taken as a sign of Britain's lack of commitment to the Falklands, but he was overruled. Carrington, it turned out, was broadly right. The government in Buenos Aires saw Britain slashing its military and removing its presence on the South Atlantic, and interpreted it as a sign that Britain's commitment to the islands was waning. This came on top of London's non-response to the occupation of southern Thule and the total disregard of the Shackleton Report in the mid-1970s, which had recommended £12 million of government investment in the islands. As far as the junta could make out, Britain had no interest in investing economically in the islands, no interest in defending it militarily, and no interest in responding to breaches of its sovereignty. If we're asking why Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, it might be because the UK government gave them every reason in the world to think that they would get away with it. It was against this backdrop of British weakness and apparent disinterest that a new Argentine junta took office in December 1981, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri. At the time, Argentina had severe economic problems that the new president needed a distraction from, so he planned 1982 to be the year of the Malvinas. Either Britain would hand the islands over, or Argentina would take them. To minimise any prospect of a British response to this, the junta planned to occupy the islands in September 1982, as by this time HMS Endurance would be on her way back to Britain, and the Argentine Navy would have completed its procurement of 18 French-built Superintendar strike fighters, complete with modern Exocet anti-ship missiles. Until then, diplomacy would continue between the nations. The Argentine Foreign Minister Nicanor Costa Mendes sought to prepare the ground for an invasion, issuing a statement in February 1982 warning that Argentina was prepared to use other means to regain the islands if diplomacy failed. It was a carefully planned diplomatic offensive, calibrated to peak just at the moment the invasion was scheduled for in September. But then, out of the blue, the entire plan was turned upside down by the most unlikely of sources. On March 17, 1982, a group of scrap metal workers landed on the British-controlled and Argentinian-claimed island of South Georgia, about 900 miles southwest of the Falklands. They were charged with dismantling an old whaling station at Leith to which their boss, Konstantino Davidov, had bought the rights in 1979. The group travelled in the Argentine Navy transport Bahia Buen Suceso, which had been hired as a private charter with, supposedly, no military personnel on board. The British authorities had given permission for Davidov's crew to make the journey, but requested a permit be picked up from the British base on the island at Grytviken. 2 days after landing, though, no Argentinian had reported to Grytviken, and worse, an Argentine flag had been spotted flying at Leith. Now, it's possible that this was just an over-exuberant metal worker, but it's also very possible, as some sources suggest, the Argentine government had slipped some Marines aboard the apparently civilian charter to try and repeat the trick of southern Thule 6 years before. Either way, the British certainly feared something sinister was going on. Staff at Grytviken reported to Rex Hunt, the governor of the Falklands, who ordered that they insist the metal workers lower the flag and report to Grytviken. The flag was removed soon afterwards, but still nobody appeared to get the required approvals. As a result, Governor Hunt made a report to London, reporting that what he believed to be Argentine military troops had landed on South Georgia, and gave his opinion that the whole expedition was probably a cover for a seizure of the island. On receipt of Hunt's message, the British government ramped things up. They demanded that the Argentines leave South Georgia and ordered HMS Endurance to sail for the island from the Falklands with 22 Royal Marines on board. On March 21st, the Bahia Buen Sucesso quickly left South Georgia, perhaps because it had been caught out putting troops where they shouldn't have been, but did not, crucially, take the metalworkers with it. On March 23rd, the Foreign Secretary sent an ultimatum: remove the metalworkers, or the Royal Marines would do so by force. This message from the British was a sharp and sudden escalation and put the Argentine junta in a bit of a difficult position. Deciding that they could not suffer the indignity of Argentine workers being arrested and deported at gunpoint from what they saw as rightful Argentinian land, the junta dispatched their own vessel to South Georgia with 14 Marines on board. By March 25th, there were two rival armed parties on South Georgia, 20 miles apart. With Britain suddenly and unexpectedly responding forcefully to events in the South Atlantic, Argentina now dramatically accelerated its plans. Worried that the Brits might reinforce the Falklands amid the crisis, the invasion plans were brought up and the Argentine Navy asked to carry out the landings as quickly as possible. Just days later, on March 28th, a large Argentine fleet put to sea under Vice Admiral Juan Lombardo, bound for the Falklands. Task Force 20, including the aircraft carrier 25 de Mayo, was present only as a demonstration of Argentina's power, with Task Force 40 under Rear Admiral Carlos Busa to carry out operations against the islands. This group contained the Argentine Navy's most modern ships, including the two Type 42 anti-air destroyers that had been bought from Britain in the 1970s. As the Argentinian invasion flotilla sailed into some bad autumn weather on the evening of March 28th, its movement was picked up by British intelligence. Britain was desperate to avoid an Argentine invasion and pushed the United States, who had established themselves as allies of Argentina in the 1970s, to warn off the junta from such a course of action. President Reagan would eventually speak with Galtieri, but with no success. The UK government also started to take military action, hoping it could do some last-minute deterrence. 3 nuclear-powered attack submarines were hurriedly prepared for dispatch to the South Atlantic, but the first would not arrive for 10 days. In the meantime, HMS Endurance, steaming on March 31st as fast as it could back towards the Falklands, would be very much alone. As far as her captain Nick Barker knew, the nearest British naval unit was at Gibraltar, 7,000 miles away. By the evening of April 1st, Task Force 40 was approaching its landing points near Port Stanley. Final preparations were made. Rear Admiral Busa addressed the landing force aboard the assault ship Cabo San Antonio. "We have been chosen by destiny to carry out one of the dearest ambitions of the Argentine people, to recover the Malvinas Islands. I expect from you bravery in battle, respect for your enemy, and generosity in victory. I warn you that if there are any excesses against the enemy troops, women, or private property, I will impose the maximum penalty." At 9:30 PM on April 1st, the Type 42 destroyer Santissima Trinidad dropped anchor about a mile off to the coast of Stanley, the capital of the Falkland Islands. Rubber boats were lowered into the water and just shy of 90 Argentinian commandos began their journey to the coast. It took an hour and a half for the Marines to paddle to the shore, getting stuck amongst kelp beds on the way, and ending up making landfall at Lake Point, some distance east of their intended landing area, up Mullet Creek. This meant they would have more ground to cover to reach their objectives and would need to get a move on. The commandos divided into 2 groups, most of their strength under the command of Lieutenant Commander Sanchez Sabarots, headed 6 miles northwest to Middlebrook Barracks, where the Royal Marine garrison of around 70 soldiers was expected to be. A smaller party of 16 men, led by Lieutenant Commander Pedro Jaquino, began a hike to Government House to arrest the governor and seize control of the island. Sabarot's company surrounded the barracks at 5:30 am to leave the Marines with no escape. They were surprised to discover that the barracks were in fact completely deserted, but this didn't stop them pouring gunfire and tear gas and other grenades into the building regardless. This sudden eruption of fire at Moody Brooks was clearly audible several miles away in Stanley, where the Royal Marines were actually positioned. Under Major Mike Norman, they had manned a variety of locations to the east designed to intercept an Argentine force landing on the expected beaches west of Cape Pembroke. At 6:05 am, the sound of gunfire coming from the west of Government House rang alarm bells for Major Norman. Most of his troops were facing the wrong way if the attack came from this direction. He ordered 2 sections to relocate and take up positions west and south of Government House to bolster its defences, and hurried there himself. At 6:15, Lieutenant Commander Giacchino, still sticking to the plan that assumed the Royal Marines would be asleep in their barracks, approached the rear of the building with 4 of his men. They barely made it into the grounds at the rear of the house before gunfire rang out from the defending Marines, mortally wounding Lieutenant Commander Giacchino and pinning the others down. A furious gun battle now began, with machine gun fire and stun grenades thrown from the Argentinian commandos. By 6:20, the attack had stalled and the Argentines retreated, leaving Giacchino and 2 other wounded behind. Luckily for them, reinforcements were on the way. At 6:30, the main landing force began to arrive west of Cape Pembroke, with 20 Amtraks departing from Cabo San Antonio and rolling ashore, carrying troops from the 2nd Marine Battalion. Pushing south, they seized the airport and detached 1 army platoon to clear the runway, and then pushed across a narrow bit of land known as the Neck. 2 British sections under Lieutenant Bill Trollope prepared to engage the column just outside Stanley. At 7:15, they fired on the lead group with 2 anti-tank launchers. Initial shots were wayward, but when one vehicle closed to within 150 metres, it was hit twice with rockets and began to billow with smoke. The Royal Marines did not have time to cheer this success though. Fire from the other Amtraks intensified and soon forced them to retreat into Stanley. They fought a rearguard action back towards Government House, exchanging small arms fire with the oncoming Argentines. By 8 am, the situation was deteriorating for the British. The commandos from Moody Brooks had pushed east and were now engaged in increasingly heavy fighting around Government House, while the Royal Marines ultimately did not have the equipment to take on the Amtraks that were rolling their way through Stanley. Reluctantly, at 9:30, Governor Hunt agreed to stop fighting. An Argentine flag was raised over Government House, and the battle was over. Against hopeless odds, the Royal Marines had resisted for 3 hours and suffered no casualties of their own. The numbers killed and wounded for Argentina are contested and range from 1 killed, 2 wounded to perhaps 20 to 30 casualties, but there's a number of conflicting accounts. Within hours of the end of the battle, the defeated British personnel were flown off the islands, though not before some propaganda photos had been taken of them lying face down and distributed widely, and repatriated back to the UK via Uruguay in the coming days. By the afternoon of April 2nd, more Argentine troops were flying in to take up garrison duty, and a team of officials were arriving to set up their civil administration of the islands. Las Malvinas had been recaptured, and there were scenes of jubilation on the streets of Buenos Aires. The mood was quite the opposite in London. News of the invasion slowly filtered through on April 2nd, and it sent shockwaves through the British government. Its attempts at deterrence and delay over years had failed. Margaret Thatcher faced a fiery House of Commons on Saturday, April 3rd. Far from being the acclaimed Iron Lady she would later be known as, Thatcher had to fight for her government's political survival in a chamber angry at both the Argentines and her administration's handling of the crisis. The Prime Minister's attempts to explain the government's actions over the previous days were met with first derisive laughter.
Yesterday morning at 8:33 a.m. we sent a telegram. At 8...
and then later general outrage.
I contacted President Reagan that evening and asked him to intervene with the Argentine president directly. We promised in the meantime to take no action to escalate the dispute for fear of precipitating the very event.
Faced with political oblivion if the nation allowed this seizure of the Falklands to stand, Thatcher announced that
the government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete. HMS Invincible will be in the lead and will leave port on Monday.
Behind this short sentence was the largest and riskiest mobilisation of the British Armed Forces in 3 decades. An amphibious task force was to operate 8,000 miles from home indefinitely. The battle for the Falkland Islands was just beginning.